for our final graphing example, we gotta look at this guy. And in this situation, we have something a little bit different. This time, you actually have a 2 inside the cosine. So this is actually a horizontal compression. Okay. So what does that mean? That means that when we go to graph this guy, I'm going to label this here as 1 and this here as -1. But this means the period of cosine, instead of filling out all of 2 pi, it's going to happen, the new period is 0 to pi. So basically, I'm looking at this 0 to pi range, and I'm fitting in 1 period of cosine. So we're going to start at 1. We're going to go down to 0. We're going to go down to -1. I'm going to go back to 0. I'm going to go back up to 1. And that's 1 period of cosine. Now we're going to go all the way to 0 to 2 pi, so we just replicate this graph again. So here's another, and another. So within the 0 to 2 pi range, you actually have 2 periods of cosine. Okay. And we know at this point, right in between pi over 2 and pi is, that's pi over 4. This point right in between pi over 2 and pi, I meant 0 and 2 pi. 0 and pi over 2 is pi over 4. Between pi over 2 and pi is 3 pi over 4. Between pi and 3 pi over 2 is 5 pi over 4. And between 3 pi over 2 and 2 pi is 7 pi over 4. So I could even label these angles for you. So this is pi over 4. This is 5 pi over 4. This is, I'm sorry, that was 3 pi over 4. Whoops. 3 pi over 4. This is 5 pi over 4. This is 7 pi over 4. Right? Why don't we this time have our unit circle, make this circle go all the way out to here. So this will be R. This will be 1. Okay. So let's graph this guy. So theta equal to 0, I'm at 2. Oops. Theta equal to 0. You know what? Let me plot all the thetas in green actually. So then I don't have to keep making those orange direction arrows. So this would be 0, this would be pi over 2, this would be pi, this would be 3 pi over 2. So let's graph this in navy. So when I'm facing the 0 direction, I go all the way out to a distance 1. We're going to put 1 at the edge of the circle. Okay. When I'm facing pi over 4, I go back to 0. So somehow in between going from the angle of 0 to pi over 4, my radius decreased down to 0, like that. Okay. Then what happens? So that's this first leg right here. For the second leg, do you see how I'm going behind myself? So what that means is I'm facing this pi over 4 direction. And as I go from pi over 4 to pi over 2, I actually go behind myself. And when I'm facing pi over 2, I actually get the point -1. So I'm facing pi over 2, I go behind myself to -1. That takes me here. And as we can see, this leg of the graph is negative. That means you're going behind yourself. So when you go behind yourself, it looks like this. Okay. That's handling the case where I'm now went from pi over 4 to pi over 2. Now I want to go from pi over 2 to 3 pi over 4. So I want this part. And 3 pi over 4 is this part, right? So the reason why I have to draw these arrows is because I want you to know which direction we're going, so you can imagine we're going behind ourselves. So when we go behind ourselves, when I'm facing 3 pi over 4, I go back to 0. So I'm basically from behind myself going from -1 to 3 pi over 4, like that. Okay, and that's that guy. So the next leg that we need to look at is the 3 pi over 4 to pi leg, the 3 over 4 to pi leg. Now we're going in front of ourselves, right? So we go out a distance 2, go out a distance 1, so then this takes us all the way back out here. Whoops, put that in the wrong place. We were going from 3 pi over 4 to pi. So I should probably put the pi here like this. When I hit pi, I'm going in front, right? Not behind, I'm going in front of myself. So then I'm facing pi and the radius is 1, so the dot comes like this. So we're going from 0 to 1 as we swing from 3 pi over 4 to pi. So it goes this. Okay. Then the next leg looks like this. We're going to go from 1 back to 0 as my angle changes from pi to 5 pi over 4. So during that time, my r goes from 1 all the way back to 0. Okay. All right. So now check it out. This part, we have to go behind ourselves, right? So when we go behind, that means that when you're facing the 3 pi over 2 direction, your radius is -1. So that's going to be going behind you right here. And we're starting at 5 pi over 4 behind us at 0, and then we just go, oops, it goes like this. Okay. That was this this part we just graphed there. All right, whoops. All right, cool. So so now we want to grab the second to last leg. So the second to last leg is this part, and we're going out to 7 pi over 4. And you're going behind yourself, right? So we're behind ourselves. We're like 1 behind ourselves, and then we end up 0 behind ourselves. So we look like this, and that's that leg. You can probably imagine what happens at the end. Ugh. What happens at the end is this part, and that's going to go from 7 pi over 4 to 2 pi, and we get this guy coming here like this. Okay. So this graph is what we call a 4-leaf rose. It's a 4-leaf rose. Okay. I'm making a video. So you can kind of see the parts that go behind yourself, right? So like sometimes I do this where I'll shade some stuff. So if I go, okay, this part of the graph, if you think of this area as forming one leaf, that's like this leaf right here, right? Then when you look at when you look at this part that's below the axis right there, that's all the stuff that's going behind you from pi over 4 to 3 pi over 4. That's this entire thing right here. Right. Then when you look at the next part, that's this part that's above. The part that's above, that means all the action is happening in front of you. That's this part right here. Okay. Then we see that there's another piece below the axis. So this part that's below the axis right here, that's all going behind you. And that's when you're moving from 5 pi over 4 to 7 pi over 4. So you see that 5 pi over 4 to 7 pi over 4, and then if you go behind you, that's this leaf right here. right? And then the last leg, this part is above the axis. That means it's going in front of you. So this guy is like this last part of the leaf there. Okay. So that's a 4-leaf rose. If you look at the sine one, if you look at sine 2 theta, r equal to sine 2 theta, that actually looks like this. It's like rotated 45 degrees, or pi over 4. And actually, when you have an odd number of leaves, so if you have a cosine of 3 theta, that gives you actually a 6-leaf rose. Anyways, let's end it here.